And our next speaker is also great. So speaking next with a paper entitled Aryan oh, my dyslexia is really bumping right now. Aztlan, the bizarre world of Aztec Nazi black metal is Alex Gendler. And Alex Gendler is a Soviet Ukrainian-born, Brooklyn-based freelance writer, editor, and translator whose output has spanned multiple fields and formats. While perhaps best known for authoring wholesome educational content for TED-Ed's animated video lessons, such as The Wars That Inspired Game of Thrones, How to Recognize Dystopia, and History versus Genghis Khan, his true interests lie in the fringes of history, philosophy, and internet culture. His independent work includes a historical analysis of the incel phenomenon published in American Affairs and an exploration of Mexico's Aztec NSBM scene in the now defunct No Recess magazines, as well as appearances on podcasts such as Parallax Views, Zero Squared, and the Antifada. So without further ado, take it away, Alex.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were, when I was writing that bio, I didn't know you were going to have to read it all out loud.
Oh, I apologize because I just have dyslexia. So I was like, oh no, I apologize
like,
myself.
This seems actually really long when it's right out loud. Anyway,
sorry,
yeah,
the chair was having connectivity issues, so we had to make do with that bio.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks guys for having me. This is actually like my first kind of like conference presentation, so bear with me. Thank you, Nelson and Daniel, for amazing panel. It's kind of hard to follow that, a little bit awkward almost, I would say, because my content is a little darker. Let me, I have a slideshow here. Let me, should I just share my screen? Okay.
Yep, you could just share it.
Let's see real quick. Yeah. Okay. Is that working? You guys can see that?
Yep, I can.
Okay, great. So yeah, just I guess getting all the disclaimers out of the way. Yeah, this is about this is going to be about like NSBM, like National Socialist Black Metal. So there's going to be a lot of discussion of like Nazism, fascism, you know, unpleasant stuff. So anyone who would feel uncomfortable with that. And then, you know, sort of a more personal disclaimer, like, you know, I'm not someone who's embedded in like Latin American or indigenous culture. So this is very much like an external gaze kind of analysis. And it's not even really so much, it's not as much of a deep dive as like, oh, what does it say about Latin American or indigenous metal, or like even a deep analysis of these scenes. It's more of like, basically, this exists, let's look at this phenomenon, and then kind of a broader look at how does this connect to sort of larger themes in both metal and in like kind of cultural history. So, you know, just bear that, just to bear all that in mind. And yeah, I did have to kind of find a lot of, as you can imagine with this kind of content, a lot of this stuff has been like taken down, rightfully so. A lot of it is so, you know, it's a lot of, you know, not promoting this stuff, obviously, but including it here for our study. So yeah, with that in mind, I guess let's take a look. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, most of us who are like academically inclined and have followed the metal scene will be aware that, you know, the whole issue of like far right politics and Nazism has been like coming more, it's been an issue in metal almost since the beginning, or at least since the like late 80s, early 90s, but especially with the internet and with social media, it's really like kind of come to the forefront, right? And it's reached beyond metal. It's appeared in various other weird places in pop culture, from you know, Nazi furries to Nazi vaporwave, fashwave. And so, you know, there's the kind of like cultural syncretism which, as I'll explain later, has kind of always been a part of far right politics. In the internet age, it's just accelerated, like turned up to 11. But so with that in mind, we all know about our old friend Varg here, Burzum, Absurd. So these were the early wave of Nazi black metal bands coming out of Norway, Northern Europe, which like expected, right? Because this idea of like Aryan white supremacy, the master race, right? Then when the more recent wave, the locus has kind of shifted towards Eastern Europe. This is nocturnal mortem unfortunately from my home city of Kharkiv, Ukraine. Polish bands also, which okay, yeah, still white supremacy, right? But it complicates the narrative a little bit more because these were the people and territories that suffered the most under the Nazis, who considered Slavs to be subhuman. So then there's this question of like, why are they adopting these ideologies, right? And then where you get the weirdest thing is you get literally bands from places like Mexico or Peru adopting the same iconography, which you have to kind of ask, okay, what is going on there? Because at this point, we can't really call it white supremacy anymore the same way that we do with the other bands. So I guess let's dive into that. I'm focusing on a particular scene here, which is it's basically this one organization that is mostly, as far as I can tell, functions as a record label. It's the Organización Nacional Socialista Pagana. So the ONSP, and they're a label. They used to have a pretty extensive Bandcamp page that has since been taken down. This is a screenshot of it. You can see it's just like a little bit of their catalog. And you can see the kind of combination of the sort of like swastika black sun with kind of indigenous Mexica motifs. I'll just play a couple of short clips. You can see what this sounds like. So this is Macuahuitl. Sorry, I also apologize for my pronunciation. I mean, the Spanish pronunciation is maybe sometimes okay, but my Nahuatl, no. But yeah, they're named after the sort of obsidian blade that Aztec warriors would use. This kind of stuff, you could hear it and see it, and you might not even recognize that it's National Socialist in any way. They're like, honestly, like on a musical perspective, I would say these guys are pretty good. If they were too bad, they're problematic to listen to. Mostly drawing from like second wave with some more recent like atmospheric melodic stuff. Then you get into more of like the bringing the indigenous elements really like out into the open. And there's an extent to which debate, like, is this cosplay or is this authentic? Like, because I mean, a lot of these bands are from Mexico City, not from but it's certainly not up to me to like try to delve into and police like who are these like white Mexicans? Are they authentically indigenous? Because really, trying to impose those like super like America-centric conceptions of race onto other countries is pretty like problematic in itself. But just sort of letting this speak for itself. Kind of like Aztec costume, pan flutes, different stuff. This is more of like the pre-ritual. Yeah, it's just but yeah, and then it's pretty more or less standard black metal with these kind of additional indigenous elements. So let's go to the next one. This one it's interesting. It's the use of like this is almost like trolling, right? Because the song called HH, which, you know, the Nazis used to stand for Hail Hitler, except in this case it stands for Hail Huitzilopochtli, who is the Aztec god of war. Yeah, and you can see, yeah, again, this sort of like combining of symbolism. So, you know, with all those, having seen all those, yeah, you can hear the pan flutes here again, by the way. So, you know, it's like without the imagery, you would just think, okay, yeah, this is like folk, this is like pagan folk metal, right? But so, okay, so having seen all that, like what's going on here? How do we put all this together? And you can see that you would think maybe that it's just like aesthetic trolling, like, right, that they just took, you know, stuff from the earlier NSBM waves of Northern Europe and just adapted it to the, adapted the aesthetics to the local indigenous context. But it's not just on an aesthetic level, right? If you look at the lyrics, if you look at the song titles here, you can see that there's like certain themes, right? So, I mean, anti-Semitism, that's the obvious one. Like that's unfortunately easy for people all around the world to get on board with. The kind of like anti-LGBT, like what, you know, degeneracy, that's also like a very common, you know, that's unfortunately common in like plenty of non-Western cultures. It's not really surprising. So there's, but there's also, you know, you can see here there is some of that like intercultural like racial thing, you know, like Mexico para los Mexicanos, the like anti-immigrant kind of thing, presumably from other parts of Latin America, considering themselves superior. But you see here, Mexican wolves against the New World Order, right? And the New World Order is a common sort of far-right conspiracy, you know, like Alex Jones type thing, like the elites controlling the world. So there's a general theme of like anti-modernity, anti-globalism, and uncomfortably also anti-colonialism, which is kind of like, especially like, yeah, following Daniel Nelson's panel, is this sort of like one possible dark path that like a really sort of kind of what I would say like vulgar anti-colonialism can take. And so this is actually not really unprecedented because you know, it took me a little while looking around to find this. This is Varg from Burzum. You know, he has been recording his like you know, far right rants as a vlog for a while now, and this one is called Dear Native Americans, where he just his accent. He specifically draws parallels between the experience of because, you know, Varg is his worldview is very, it's anti-Christian, and the idea that Christianity, which for Varg is a Jewish religion, destroyed the native indigenous cultures and traditions of Europe. And he specifically draws a parallel between that experience and that of the Native Americans. So, you know, it's like these kinds of like they destroyed your sacred trees, they you know, raised your children in their religion. So there's this kind of like, again, a vulgar decolonial appeal from like the white nationalists, like far right, to kind of like indigenous peoples. And so this seems like a modern thing, right? Again, like the internet, people can just kind of mix and match whatever ideologies they want. You're crazy, but it actually has a longer history in that. So this is picture here is someone called Savitri Devi, and she was I believe a Greek-born, but also with French ancestry, like aristocratic woman in like the early 20th century, who became a big, got super, like, you know, maybe the original like white woman yoga influencer, but also was a huge proponent of fascism and a fan of, I think she declared Hitler to be the like reincarnation of the avatar of Krishna, I think, or one of the other Indian gods. But you know, and then there was this guy, Baron von Ungern Sternberg, who was a Russian nobleman, general in the White Army, who was Russian Orthodox, ended up briefly conquering Mongolia during the chaos of the Civil War in like 1918, and declaring himself the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. And he sort of had this like syncretism of Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Buddhism. And apparently, you know, he meditated, he fasted, he believed that like extreme violence was spiritually purifying. So there's a lot of really messed up shit he did to prisoners. You know, he was eventually deposed and killed by the Red Army. But he did become this kind of icon of this sort of like far right cultural syncretism. And so this has really been a part of far right politics from, you know, from basically the OG like far right politics of Nazism, which, yeah, you know, why did they use the swastika? It was something they appropriated from, you know, it was based in these like when 19th century anthropologists were first like sort of developing the field of Indo-European studies and discovering the ancient connection between like, you know, Sanskrit and European languages. All of these romantic nationalists, you know, their imaginations ran wild, and they appropriated like all these Buddhist and Hindu cultural symbols for their sort of like modern projects that cloak themselves as like looking back to you know, glorious ancient past. And you know, there's more kind of silly examples. This is something that comes up a lot. The idea that the Nazis considered the Sioux Nation, and by extension other Native Americans, to be honorary Aryans, based on the fact that, like, you know, they migrated from Central Asia and from a supposedly Aryan population. I haven't actually been able to find, this is something that you see in a lot of like news articles and kind of like just like casually referenced. I haven't actually been able to find the original like scholarly source for this, and I'm kind of suspecting that there might not be one. It might just be like something that was mentioned in passing, and then kind of like everyone citing the same thing. But it's popular enough to that even some like indigenous you know, people who were far right kind of reference that positively, and definitely the band Sacrificial Massacre, who I'll get to later, they mention that. So yeah, but what is definitely true, even if this is not supported, was that part of the Nazis' like appeal to the other nations of the world was that they themselves, that Germany itself was a subaltern nation who had been like unfairly excluded by the imperial hegemons like UK, France, and that they had like kind of, they made an appeal to, you know, people in India, even people in Ireland, fortunately even people like in my home country of Ukraine, where we are actually the champions of like the world's oppressed people against the imperial hegemons. Like we represent you more than these people do. And in some of these countries, people believe in it. And in fact, that legacy has kind of has not completely died. For example, in India and in a lot of other developing countries, Hitler is not considered like, you know, evil incarnate the way we've kind of agreed in the West. He's either like a funny guy to put on your business logos, or there's a whole, I wasn't able to find any like screenshot example. There's a whole genre of like the way that like Western businessmen will quote Sun Tzu and, you know, like the art of war for business. There's like you know, inspirational business advice from Hitler. And so this is kind of a thing. And the idea is that, you know, the idea that he rapidly industrialized and modernized Germany is also like still kind of popular in the developing world. And the other thing is that so for all the reasons I mentioned, it's actually not that surprising that Nazism is not purely a white phenomenon and has actually spread to places like you see in the pictures, Malaysia. There's a I forget what the band is called, Boot, I think Bootmark or something like that. But yeah, they're a Malaysian NSBM band. And I mean, with Malaysia is an interesting case because of that there you have a whole like racial interplay between you know, Malays and Malay and Chinese, and so the racism is definitely like they adapt the racial structure to the local conflicts. But still, this is like just like a jarring image, right? Because so yeah, what is, you know, just to kind of like sum all that up, where does that what are the kind of like sort of root elements, like the common like through lines that we see with all this stuff? And you know, for one thing, you know, not to overstate like the deep philosophical stuff, like on a very surface level, it's just like the pure edginess factor, right? And I think what actually, there's a kind of like almost paradox here, because the sort of like positive kind of kernel under all this, it shows just how much of like an international language metal itself is, and metal culture, that it does, and in its positive manifestations, it really is like just this idea of like an international brotherhood that accepts all like outcasts, and that these kinds of like this kind of like basic impulse appeals to people in all sorts of societies, and the idea that it is true to some extent that like if you're, you know, traveling somewhere on the other side of the world and you just go into a metal bar, you can immediately, like, again with caveats depending on local prejudices or whatever, but there is a sort of like instant connection there, kind of like instant sense of that you belong to some kind of like local community. But it's sort of perverted and kind of, I mean, Darkwind, like what spreads internationally apparently also very easily is hate, right? So you know, there's kind of like, it's the two sides of that coin. It both like brings people together and you know, reinforces these kinds of like hate lines. There's generally, and I mean, this is something that we see beyond metal and beyond, I think the sort of like horseshoe theory of like kind of environmentalism and like local environmentalism and anti-globalism and anti like kind of like a very naive like anti-elite anti-corporate stuff. You know, you see that with a lot of say like the anti-vax you know, pandemic discourse, where someone can be talking about, you know, the elites and big pharma and whatever, and they could either be a far leftist or a far rightist, and it's kind of hard to distinguish just from like that kind of rhetoric at this point. Or what I think there's a very influential paper, I think a podcast now called Conspirituality, where these sort of like traditionally kind of like leftish like hippie ideas of you know, being one with nature and being like kind of anti-industrialization, anti-corporate, get combined with this kind of far right like crypto anti-Semitic, like, oh, the shadowy cabal of elites are controlling all this. So there's that, and you know, yeah, the fascism as the kind of the socialism of fools, which I talked about, right? How, you know, it had this full appeal to the masses. They wouldn't say the working class, right? But they just like this cross-class idea of like the true masses, the true people of whatever country, versus against like the foreign elements, the like shadowy cabal of elites who's pulling the strings behind society. And you know, in this case, like the globalists. And I talked about how Germany cast itself as like this sort of plucky up and comer, the oppressed nation versus the kind of hegemonic nations. But I think the deeper kind of thread that actually ties all this together is just something that's been present in metal since the beginning, not necessarily in far right forms, but I think the reason that metal is consistently in danger of like falling into this path is that it's largely based on this like Rousseauian kind of like romanticism, and a looking back to like a purer past, like the fallen, like the modern fallen world that's like inauthentic, and that there's some true authentic unity to be discovered somewhere in the past, whether it lies in nature or in fantasy, like feudal kingdoms with a very nice ordered hierarchy, Lord of the Rings type stuff, or like the true like pagan religion that was closer to the land than Christianity, or just like anti-industrialism. So all of that kind of, and I think I'm thinking back to what Daniel and Nelson ended with in their presentation, how you can't just look back, you have to look back in order to move forward. And so that's really the kind of missing element when I think a lot of metal and culture in general gets lost in this romantic idealization of the past. It can kind of manifest in these sort of toxic ways. Yeah, and so with that in mind, right, we all know there's been like more attention paid to like fascism and metal, and like there's been a lot of like anti-fascist activity trying to like sort of purge metal scenes of this kind of like tolerance of fascism, right? And to the point of like boycotting venues, like shutting down shows where they host these bands. So that's easier to do when sort of the enemy is more kind of visible, right? When you have a band like Absurd or or Peste Noire, right? Like a very white band using white power, so that it's like very sort of obviously fascist. It gets a little more like awkward and complicated when the bands are not, at least what in Western countries would be seen as white, and especially if anti-fascist activists, like, which is kind of like an ongoing discussion within anti-fascist circles, that they are still disproportionately white, right? So you get like a kind of weird sometimes idea of like largely white Antifa metalheads protesting like a Latin American band playing. So and that's something it's especially hard because they might, because of the reasons I mentioned. So like this band Sacrificial Massacre, they just recently played. Jeremy, thank you for alerting me to that. I think they played in Chicago. Is that right? Yeah. And they didn't announce the venue until the very last minute because they didn't want Antifa to shut it down. But the other thing is like Sacrificial Massacre has songs about decolonization mixed in with all the other stuff. So again, just like I talked about fascism being the the socialism of fools. I forget if that was a Trotsky quote. But in a lot of ways, like this kind of stuff, this like this kind of like pagan Nazism, pagan indigenous Nazism is sort of like the decolonization of fools. Because it sort of shifts the blame from kind of the processes of like capital accumulation and colonization and the actual like European empires that perpetrated that colonization to like basically like, oh, it was all this eternal cabal of who pulling the strings behind the scenes. Which is kind of why they can both make songs about slaughtering conquistadors while also using like white supremacy symbols. But yeah, and then Maquahuitl just got booked for Steelfest apparently. But yeah, that they often have NSBM bands. So this is like an ongoing thing, I guess, to be aware of. And yeah, I mean, I think just the kind of our material and online culture is just very fertile for this kind of thing to continue churning, like just new Twitter ideologies appear by the dozens every day, right? Just hyphenate whatever, like I'm a I mean, people label themselves in Islamo-fundamentalist Orthodox Stalinist or something, right? So yeah, that's basically that, and I guess I'll open it up to questions. Stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. Now let's see, and make sure to message to DM me if you have any questions. Thank you, Alex. I was just scrolling up to see what Jeremy and I were speaking when you were presenting in the chat, so I'll just go off this. We were wondering if any of the bands you covered were particularly influenced by Giulio or Julius Evola.
Oh yeah, he was someone I forgot to mention. Yeah, I was gonna briefly mention him when I was talking about Savitri Devi. I didn't see that. Honestly, I think they're not at that level of nerdery.
Oop. Or apologies, I lost you there.
Wait, me or
Alex, if you could just re-answer that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, yeah, I forgot to mention Evola. I was gonna mention him when I was talking about Savitri Devi. Yeah, he's obviously along the same lines of that like trying to mine like Eastern and other like non-Western cultures for his kind of like far right syncretism. I didn't come across any Evola references in their stuff. I think these guys' aesthetic is like not quite as academic. Basically, they're not at that nerd level of quoting Evola, but like I'm sure the indirect influence is definitely there. Yeah. Oh, you're muted, Amanda.
Sorry. I know Jeremy specifically, apologies, was asking about Evola because of the mention of the mythical Aztec homeland, Aztlan, in the north, which Evola, you know, assimilates with Hyperborea. The Aryan homeland. So I know that was why Jeremy was specifically interested in like asking
no, I mean,
that.
That was just the catchy title I picked for when I was pitching the article. Yeah, that was all me.
And the other question was if you filmed the video yourself of the band and the club.
No, I did not. I got that from it was an article actually in the French socialist magazine Liberation from a few years ago. Someone who actually went to Mexico, and yeah, this is all secondhand reporting on my part.
And the final inquiry I have is, from Alejandro, do you believe that among these Aztec New Scene Black Metal or NSBM groups, a similar organization akin to the Wolves of Vinland will form?
Well, I mean, they claim to be such an organization, like ONSP claims to be not like a political organization rather than, as far as I can tell, they're mostly a record label, but this is kind of how, and you know, this is something that someone who's like people who are in Mexico who are closer, like, you know, if you see like far right attacks being carried out by people linked to this, like that would definitely be something to look into. Like I haven't been able to find anything like that. Like, they might just be LARPing, but you know, from an example closer to home, in Ukraine has kind of been, unfortunately, like, you know, a lot of times exaggerated by Russian media, but it is there. You know, Ukraine has been kind of like a center of like a Nazi activity, not just by locals, but it's kind of become a hub for, like, for example, Famine from Peste Noire literally went to Kiev to live and train with, you know, some of those guys in the Azov battalion. And they run a label called Militant Zone, and that's run by a guy actually from Russia originally, like a far right nationalist from Russia who came over to Ukraine. and I forget what his name is. He's the guy from Molotov. So they run a record label. They run the Asgard Rai Fest in Kiev, and they use that to like raise funds for the Azov Battalion. So it's definitely like kind of a scary example of how like music can actually be used. It's not just LARPing. They're actually, this is like a very tightly run financial organization with its with many hands. I don't think ONSP is that advanced or dangerous. I don't want to suggest that it is. This was just like an example. But there's nothing theoretically stopping an organization like that from becoming that, because you see the examples in Ukraine. It's kind of like that's served as like an inspiration of for fascists around the world, of like how they can have this kind of like street organization and multimedia campaign.
We have to keep tight to time, but I hope I could talk your ear off about National Socialist black metal using Kazakh imagery in bands in the East, hopefully, or in what we deem is the East and the West, because that's disconcerting to me, but we have to move on. But I definitely want to talk your ear off about that, because I have questions